So today we have Hans Pedersen from nearby Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He got his PhD from the University of South Florida in 2009, and he's since written some papers on Heidegger and will have published in the coming year by Springer a co-edited volume of essays called The Horizons of Authenticity. That's an anthology, and the paper that he's contributed to that volume is on Kierkegaard and the problem of ironic agency. His current projects are Heidegger's critique of the use of the concept of causality to explain human action, and also Heidegger's interpretation of Kant's understanding of freedom. And I think those will be a background for his paper today on Heidegger, Strawson, and responsibility. So please join me in welcoming Hans Pedersen.
All right, so thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to Patrick for inviting me. I come from, we have a small department in Indiana, 5 people, and I am, the token continental person there, and so it's nice to be able to talk about some of the stuff I'm working on with people who, might maybe have a little bit more sympathy with what I'm doing and knowledge of what I'm doing. So I wanted to say a little bit about the background of this, how this paper came about, because it's kind of a weird thing to write a paper about Strawson. I should specify Galen Strawson, the younger Strawson, and Heidegger. And so last spring I taught an undergraduate seminar on freedom and responsibility. And so I was kind of doing the greatest hits of, papers in the last, 50, 60 years on freedom and responsibility. And so we talked about Galen Strawson's paper in which he famously argues that real moral responsibility is impossible. And so I, have written, really most of what I write is on Heidegger and philosophy of action and related ideas like responsibility and free will. And so I just kind of got to thinking, well, if I don't think Strawson is right, or even if I don't really have an objection to what he's saying, I should be able to explain from a Heideggerian point of view, kind of what's going on with his argument. How would, from the perspective of Heidegger's philosophy of action, how would one respond to the argument that Strawson puts forward? And so I think it's, I try to do this a lot, try to use Heidegger to kind of, and juxtapose him to various analytic thinkers, to try to hopefully keep myself from getting too far lost in kind of the thicket of Heideggerian jargon, and keep myself tethered to some other more mainstream philosophical way of talking about things, and kind of hopefully illuminate a certain perspective on what Heidegger does. And also try to make the case that, there is something worthwhile, that Heidegger isn't just this sort of historical relic, this very esoteric, difficult thinker that, sort of strange masochistic people read, but nobody else really needs to worry about. And so try to, make that case that you can still develop something interesting, more generally, useful out of Heidegger. So that's, again, kind of the background here. My approach to a lot of things I write in this particular paper, it's kind of, forcing Heidegger and Strawson together here to draw something out of Heidegger. So let me start by saying a little bit about Strawson's argument, that in case anybody hasn't read this article by Strawson. And it's, I think, it's a simple, straightforward argument. And for my purposes, at least, I don't know if this is what people always do in reading Strawson, but I broke it down into 2 main parts. And so the first part of his argument is what he calls the basic argument. And this is where he tries to show that it's impossible to truly be morally responsible for your actions. So basically what he says is that in order to be truly morally responsible, you would have to be the cause of yourself. But nobody can be the cause of herself, so nobody can be truly morally responsible. And his reason for this is that he thinks that, our characters always include certain features different aspects, different values that we don't have control over. So even if we have control over some of the facets of our character, there's always stuff that's outside of our control. So it never can be true that we really are the cause of ourselves. And if that's the case, then again, he thinks that nobody can ever be truly responsible. And so that conception of responsibility being the cause of oneself, that you have to be the cause of oneself in order to be responsible, Strawson calls that ultimate responsibility. And so I'll keep that nomenclature as I go through this, that ultimate responsibility is this idea that you are the cause of yourself. So that's the first part of his argument. He says this sort of responsibility is impossible. And then the second part is him basically saying that no other conceptions of responsibility really work or are worthwhile for us to have. So I think this is a very brief dismissal on his part. But anyhow, he considers compatibilist conceptions of responsibility. So somebody like Harry Frankfurt, who talks about first and second order desires, and would say, well, you have these immediate first order desires, and then you have desires about those desires, that you want to have certain first order desires, or you don't want to have certain first order desires. And if your first and second order desires line up, then you're a responsible agent. That's Frankfurt's view. And Strawson dismisses compatibilist views like that because he says, well, those don't really hold much weight. That if we're really coming to a strong condemnation of someone or very strong praise of someone, we wouldn't base that strong condemnation on a compatibilist conception of responsibility. They just aren't really strong enough to hold up. So he talks about how in Western history, the whole idea of heaven and hell has played an important role. So even though he's not talking about this from a religious perspective, he's saying that that's what we want out of a conception of responsibility. We want to feel like we're on solid ground when we would condemn someone to hell or say that someone is deserving of going to heaven. And these compatibilist conceptions of responsibility just don't do that. They aren't strong enough for that sort of condemnation or praise. And I think, you could put this in more secular form. I was thinking, condemning someone to a death sentence. What sort of level of moral responsibility would you want someone to have before you would feel comfortable with that type of condemnation? So that's his point, that it's more sort of this relying on kind of our gut intuitions, that we wouldn't really condemn someone to die, condemn someone to hell, if we just had these, what he thinks are these more flimsy, compatibilist conceptions of responsibility to work with. So that's where he ends with his final conclusion, saying, well, the only type of responsibility worth having is this ultimate responsibility, but that's impossible. These other types of responsibility that people have put forward are really too flimsy to do us any good. So we're left with saying that moral responsibility is just an impossibility. So that's Strawson's argument in a nutshell here. And so the way I divided up the paper is basically saying, okay, let's take the first part of that, the argument against ultimate responsibility, and see how Heidegger would respond to that, and then kind of move to the second part of Strawson's argument, where he tries to say that other types of responsibility aren't worthwhile. So this now gets more into the meat of the paper here. And now, for Heidegger, I think, there's been over, the last 30, 40 years of Heidegger scholarship, there's kind of been this evolving level of sophistication in how people interpret Heidegger, because more and more of his stuff has become published and translated. And so it used to be the case that people, knew Being and Time and maybe a couple of the more popular lectures that he gave after that, and that was kind of it. And so, earlier on in Heidegger scholarship, I think there was this tendency to read Heidegger as more kind of a run-of-the-mill existentialist. And to say, well, yeah, Heidegger does kind of give us an existentialist conception of ultimate responsibility. That if you look at a bunch of the stuff he says in Being and Time, you can see why people would come to that sort of reading. That Heidegger talks about, kind of in our ordinary everydayness, being part of the they self, not being responsible for our actions, but then in authentic action, we can somehow break out of being controlled by the homogeneous public self and become our own true selves in some sense. He talks about, resolute decisions and choosing to choose, all of these different phrases that he associates with authenticity make it sound an awful lot like, well, yeah, initially you aren't ultimately responsible because you just kind of do what everyone does, kind of follow along with these anonymous public interpretations of how you should act, but then the authentic individual is able to break out of this and really create herself or cause herself from the ground up. So that's, I think, again, kind of the older, more simplistic interpretation of Heidegger that I just wanted to bring up to kind of put that aside and get that out of the way. That I think, again, since the earlier Heidegger scholarship, it's become clear that Heidegger never really thought this, that I don't think he ever had, this sort of simplistic existentialist type of ultimate responsibility going on. And so, there's a couple places, Heidegger doesn't do himself any favors with the language that he uses at times, but Heidegger is pretty consistent throughout Being and Time, saying that, one of the three fundamental aspects of human existence is thrownness, Geworfenheit, this idea that there are just certain facets of our existence that aren't under our control, have been established, sort of when we come into the world, we already have certain ways of understanding things, certain languages that we're born into using, and that stuff is just always and forever outside of our control. That when you become authentic, that aspect of thrownness doesn't go away, it just gets dealt with in a different way. And so, he has passages like that. I thought, I didn't put that on the handout, but I thought one clear place where he says that later on in Being and Time, when he says, the self, which as such has to lay the basis for itself, can never get that basis into its power. So this is when he's talking about, even in authentic existence, nobody ever really gets their whole self completely under their grasp, completely in their control. And so that's the first kind of easy step here, just saying, well, I think that Heidegger would agree with that first part of Strawson's argument, that contrary to this kind of naive existentialist interpretation of Heidegger, he would say with Strawson that ultimate responsibility is impossible because of this kind of ineliminable aspect of thrownness in our existence. So that's, again, kind of the first easy part here. And now, I think the next stage of this, where it gets a little bit more interesting and complicated, is to delve a little further here into how Heidegger understands the self in comparison to Strawson's understanding of the self. So, I have, and Strawson, at least so far as I can make out from his article, never really gives an explicit statement of what he means by the self. I think you can kind of infer how he thinks of the self from some of his descriptions of things and the way he formulates his arguments, but that he never really says, by self I mean this, which would have been nice considering he's talking about whether or not you can be the cause of yourself to say really what he means by self. But anyhow, so I have one of his formulations of the argument against ultimate responsibility. He uses as one of his premises the following statement. He says, one cannot really be said to choose in a conscious, reasoned fashion to be the way one is, mentally speaking, in any respect at all, unless one already exists, mentally speaking, already equipped with some principles of choice, preferences, values, pro-attitudes, ideals, in the light of which one chooses how to be. And so, he's saying a couple things there, but for the purposes of this paper, what I took the implication to be from that is that Strawson kind of has, I think, a Humean understanding of the self, that there is no necessarily, unified thing that is the self, but the self is kind of a collection of these various mental phenomena. your desires, your ideals, the moral principles upon which you act. So the self is kind of what we refer to as our character. There's just kind of a conglomeration of all these different things, just sort of adding all these things up. That's yourself. And from Strawson's point of view, you can't ever be the cause of yourself, because some of those various things that make up that collection are going to be always outside of your control. So that's the way, at least from what I gather, that Strawson thinks of the self. And now Heidegger, I mean, he doesn't, at least as far as I know, necessarily address this, I think with a more Humean conception of the self. But he very definitely and very strongly addresses the Cartesian conception of the self. And so this is, again, I thought one of the clear passages from Being and Time that helps here, where he says, the person is not a thing, not a substance, not an object. So he says in no undefinite terms that, if Descartes is talking about the mind as a thinking thing, that's just wrong. And so I'm kind of taking that a further step here to say that the self is a collection of things is also going to be the wrong way of thinking about it for Heidegger. That the self is not a single thing, the self cannot be a collection of, multiple things. Anytime you're trying to define the self in those ways, for Heidegger, that's just going to be an ontological mistake. So now the tricky part is to say, well, what's the contrasting view of the self that Heidegger would propose here? And so this is not an easy thing to do succinctly, and I think the way I have it worded here, that Heidegger, depending if you want to be charitable or a little snarky, I mean, you could say that Heidegger's thought is rich enough or ambiguous enough, if you want to be snarky, that you can probably develop multiple conceptions of the self out of reading his works and looking at different works and that sort of thing. And so what I wanted to do here was kind of just focus in on one conception of the self that I think you can get out of Heidegger. And I don't want to say this is the Heideggerian understanding of the self or anything like that, but this is kind of coming out of I guess I read this 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm still working through bits of it. This 1930 lecture course from Heidegger called The Essence of Human Freedom, which for him, of course, he spends the first half of it talking about Aristotle and time for, whatever, because he just always talks about Aristotle in this time period. And then the second half of it is a very in-depth interpretation of Kant's practical philosophy. And so it's that kind of Kantian interpretation of the self that I want to develop and focus on here. And so I think sort of at the very general level, what I want to say about this Heideggerian conception of the self, and this is, I think, a way of talking about the self that has some currency in broader philosophical circles. This idea that the self is constituted through your actions and exists only in your actions. So the self isn't a thing that exists prior to action and can serve as the causal basis of action, or even a collection of things that can serve as the causal basis of action. But the self is constituted in your actions and only exists in your actions. And so this is, I'm most familiar with Christine Korsgaard's work on this idea of self-constitution. And I think you can find something similar, kind of if you're squinting at it from the right way, going on in Heidegger's stuff on Kant here. So it's going to be this idea that the self isn't a thing, it's constituted in our actions, exists only in our actions. And so from a Kantian point of view, Heidegger makes this simple equation, and I have that on the handout about halfway down the page there, that he basically, in his words here, he says, practical freedom as autonomy is self-responsibility, which is the essence of the personhood of the human person. So he's making this kind of three-term equivalence here, saying that freedom as autonomy is equal to self-responsibility, which is equal to being a person, or I'm going to use this interchangeably with the idea of being a self. And so, obviously, that requires some unpacking to see what he's trying to get at here. But I think, or at least I hope that the first term there, freedom as autonomy, so the first part of that equivalence, is kind of reasonably well understood. That the idea is that you're free if you give yourself the law that guides your actions, and that law is not heteronomous but comes from within, so that your actions are autonomous. And that's what Heidegger is saying here is the first part. He's working with that Kantian understanding of freedom, that you're free if you give yourself the law that guides your actions, and that law is something internal to you. And now, the next move there, where he's saying that that is actually another way of talking about self-responsibility, is that, the idea is that for Kant, he would say that the moral law, the categorical imperative, can be derived from the structure of practical reason itself. So it's something, within you as an agent that can serve as the basis of your actions and allow you to act autonomously. And so you're responding to something within yourself when you act in accordance with the moral law, or better say, for the sake of the moral law, you're responding to something within yourself, having that as the basis of your actions. And then the last step here is when you respond to that part of yourself that provides the basis for the moral law, in acting in such a way that your actions are self-responsive, that's how you make yourself into a person, or you make yourself into a self. And so on this view, then, the self, again, is not a thing, but the self is constituted through acting autonomously, that in all of your autonomous actions, you're constituting yourself as a self. And I know that gets a little bit redundant or circular, and maybe I have to find a better way to express that. I guess that's why I talk about person sometimes, but you're making yourself into a person through those actions that are autonomous, that are based on that law that comes from somewhere within your own being. So that's the kind of more Kantian form of this. That, from a Kantian point of view, it kind of makes sense that if you've taken an introductory ethics course, you've probably had to see the Kantian, the different formulations of the categorical imperative, the natural law formation, the respect for humanity formation. And now Heidegger is never going to just settle for kind of taking the intro to philosophy textbook definition of what any philosopher is talking about. So he has his own kind of idiosyncratic take on how we should interpret the categorical imperative. So, and again, how we should interpret that moral law that comes from within us that, can be the ground for our autonomous actions. So for him, and I don't know, it's, I guess you have to be a philosopher of a certain stature to get away with these things. But he says, the first formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, the natural law formation, is just bogus. It's this historical relic that, people in the Enlightenment really like to talk about natural laws and the power of reason, but it's just this, thing that Kant kind of said because that was what's in the air at the time, and there's really no reason to take it very seriously anymore. So that's what he says at first. Just first version of the categorical imperative, just don't really need to pay any attention to that anymore. And what he really focuses on is the second formulation of the categorical imperative. So that's the one, I have it in the Kantian language here, just so everybody's on the same page. That's acts that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. So that's the Kantian formulation. And then what Heidegger does is he wants to tweak this a little bit and says that what is meant when he reads that treat humanity as an end part, Heidegger says that what this means is that an end is represented in advance as the determining ground for the actualization of an object. And so an end for Heidegger is what is actually actualized in an action. And so the categorical imperative is commanding us to actualize humanity in our actions, and to have this actualization be that for the sake of which we are acting. And so what the next question here is, what he means by humanity. And Heidegger says that the essence of being human is personhood, Persönlichkeit in the German. So Heidegger, ends up with, I think, it seems like a bit of a circular formulation, that the categorical imperative is basically saying that you have a duty to make yourself into a person in your actions, and the way you become a person through your actions is following the categorical imperative to make yourself into a person. And so he seems to have taken things kind of back around in a circle here. And I'll get into more in the next section, how we might be able to get out of this. The hint that I just want to say now, that's more coming from his interpretation of Kant, and I think we can flesh this out given some of the stuff he says earlier in Being and Time. But he says in his interpretation of Kant, when he's talking about personhood and self-responsibility and freedom as autonomy, he says, and this is again a quote from Heidegger, experience of the person is at the same time the essential experience of man, the mode of knowing which reveals man in his proper actuality. And so he adds this epistemic component to making yourself into a person. And this is where I think the connection to Being and Time will come in later, that there's this sense that making yourself into a person requires knowledge of the ontological structure of being human. And obviously that's a big theme in the latter part, well, really through all of Being and Time, but especially in the authenticity part of Being and Time. So that's where I kind of leave the first section ending on that hint, but just saying that Heidegger develops this different kind of, again, idiosyncratic interpretation of Kant, sees the self as something that's constituted through our actions, specifically those actions that are done for the sake of making oneself into a person. So again, you have that sort of circular formulation, but the self is definitely not a thing or a collection of things, as it might be in Strawson's sense. And so that's, he agrees with Strawson that there's no such thing as ultimate responsibility, but kind of has different reasons for doing so. That he doesn't think, Strawson's conception of the self really holds up, and so he has his own reasons for not thinking that ultimate responsibility is really possible. And so then the second main section of the paper here is now kind of, in a way, although I'm not really quite happy with how I do this, is in a way addressing that second part of Strawson's argument, where Strawson makes the claim that there is no other conception of responsibility worth having, that ultimate responsibility is impossible, and furthermore, any other notion of responsibility that people come up with isn't really going to be strong enough to do what we want it to do. And so now the second main part of my paper is trying to lay out, at least in kind of sketchy form here, what an alternate Heideggerian conception of responsibility would look like that, and this is the part I'm not sure that I really answer Strawson's objections completely here, but it's kind of a Heideggerian conception of responsibility that, at least for the moment, I think is kind of neat and plausible and worth thinking about a bit. So the way I start here is considering, kind of a way of looking at responsibility that's the opposite end of the spectrum from thinking of being responsible as being the cause of yourself. And this, I don't know if anybody else has read this book. I only read the Heidegger chapters, but Francois Raffoul published a book called The Origins of Responsibility, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago, which I think it's a really, just a plug for his book here, I think it's a really interesting book where basically he goes through a whole string of continental philosophers and says, well, this is how this philosopher's conception of responsibility differs from the standard analytic conception. This is how this philosopher's conception differs. And so he spends a couple chapters talking about Heidegger in there and really focuses on this idea that what's different and special about what we can get out of Heidegger in terms of responsibility is this idea of responsibility as responsiveness. So kind of looking at that root of responsibility and seeing respond there, that it's kind of gotten distorted. There's all this stuff about causality imported into our notion of responsibility. But if you look at that root there, in English or in German, German Verantwortlichkeit, there's the same to answer, to respond. That's the root of this. And so what Refoul does is really tries to, kind of trace the way Heidegger thinks of responsiveness throughout his thought. And Refoul, I think, leans more towards the side of the later Heidegger. And so in the later Heidegger, you get these very abstract kind of, Heidegger wouldn't like the term metaphysical, but I say still metaphysical, conceptions of responsiveness, where responsibility has kind of lost any of its normal practical meanings, and in his later stuff, Heidegger's talking about responsibility as a responsiveness to being as such. And so it's this, sort of deeper, almost mystical notion where he's talking about Meister Eckhart and all this sort of stuff, and sort of always being open to be called by being and being able and willing to respond to that's what he ends up talking about with responsibility, which I think I think it's probably the right reading of Heidegger, and I think it's one that's interesting in its own right. I just don't like to go quite that far down that road because I think that there still is sort of a practical everyday function for the term responsibility in our kind of everyday discourse and talking about people's actions and making judgments about people's actions. And I worry that the later Heidegger, it kind of responsibility kind of loses that sense of being usable in those more everyday scenarios. So what I try to do here is work with this idea of responsibility as responsiveness, but not go too far down that direction where Refoul really focuses on in Heidegger's later stuff the idea of a subject or a self. Heidegger's tried to expunge that as much as he can from talking about responsibility. And I want to say that for practical purposes, we don't want to focus on just responsiveness exclusively. That there does seem to be something to Strawson's intuition that we want some kind of meaningful, robust conception of selfhood associated with saying somebody is a responsible agent. That I was thinking that we could think, I was thinking, a sort of an example where you have, say, a woman who is raised in a very strict patriarchal society, and so she sees her life purely as about being responsive to the needs of others, whether it's her husband or her father or her kids. And so in a sense, she's kind of the paradigm of completely being responsive to those around her. And that's all her life would be. And I think that, there's something missing a bit in that picture, that if we want to talk about somebody as being responsible, we still need to think of them as having at least some, more or less well-defined notion of self there. And so that if you just focus on responsiveness, you lose that idea that, there has to be a sense of selfhood that goes along with being a responsible agent. And I think, that's potentially a debatable point, but from my point of view, I'm saying that a more workable, practical notion of responsibility should have some meaningful sense of selfhood associated with it. So that's what I'm trying to do, kind of focus on responsiveness as the root of responsibility, but still leave in there some meaningful notion of selfhood. Okay, so there's, I think when we're, at least when I'm trying to do this, there's kind of two main ways of being responsive that play into the conception of responsibility I'm trying to work out here. So I think in Being in Time, you get a lot of this language. I mean, there's, these sections in Being in Time talking about the conscience and the call of conscience and responding to the call of conscience. And so I think you can work with this to kind of get the one aspect of responsiveness that's in responsibility. So, I have, again, just a handful of little quotes from Heidegger here talking about this, that, he says, the call of conscience calls one to one's own self, calls one to one's own most potentiality for being oneself. And so it seems to me here that, if you kind of combine the stuff that I talked about earlier with this Kantian conception of the self and this stuff about the call of conscience, he's talking about conscience, the call of conscience, as calling you to, make yourself into a person, to make yourself into a self. And so that for Heidegger, and this I think, it's there already in Being in Time, but it comes out more forcefully in his later stuff, that it's not a willful decision to be authentic. You can't will yourself. It's not this Nietzschean idea that it's the strength of your will that makes you into an authentic person. For Heidegger, it's always this, being open to, being responsive to the call to feel like you should try to make yourself into a person. That it always starts with that responsive element. And I thought, it's worth pointing out when he talks about resoluteness, that often is taken in this very voluntaristic, willful sense, that one of the other terms for that is, that he uses for it as an equivalence, is wanting to have a conscience. So, gewissen haben wollen. And it's this, not this, hard, willful, sort of ironclad decision that you make that makes you authentic, but it's that makes you resolute, but it's wanting to have a conscience. And the word resoluteness that gets translated as resoluteness from German, the Entschlossenheit, I think in German it has this nice double meaning of, has the prefix ent in front of schließen. Schließen means to close, so you add the negative prefix ent in front of that, it means to open. And so it has that ambiguous meaning of opening up, and also at the same time in German, entschließen does mean to, come to a firm decision, but it has kind of both aspects going on there. It gets lost a little bit when we translate it in English as resoluteness. And so that's at the one aspect of responsiveness that I think you find in Heidegger and can start working into a conception of responsibility. That we feel this call that we can respond to or fail to respond to make ourselves into persons, to really constitute ourselves through our actions. And so, again, that's kind of the first aspect of responsiveness, and that doesn't yet really get us out of the circularity issue that I mentioned above. But this is where I think, again, kind of combining Being in Time with some of the Kantian stuff from the later lecture can give us, potentially a path out of this circle. So, if you remember, in the preceding section, Heidegger says that, making yourself into a person requires knowledge, proper knowledge of the ontological structure of being human. And we get that again in different form in Being in Time, that the call of conscience, responding to the call of conscience, also is supposed to lead us to the proper ontological understanding of human existence. And so when we look at this in Being in Time, the way Heidegger works this out is by, kind of starting with the ordinary, everyday phenomenon of thinking about conscience. It says, well, when we say that, we feel our conscience tugging at us or something like that, what we're feeling is we feel an experience of guilt, that our conscience is telling us that we're guilty for something. And so Heidegger, works with that, and again kind of massages that in a different kind of less normative, more ontological direction. And so he goes through kind of these different ordinary conceptions of being guilty, what we mean by that. And so he talks about owing something or having debts, that again in the German, the Schuld haben, we might not associate so much with being guilty, but it works in the German. Feeling like we're responsible for something bad that happened, owing something to others. And so what we get from kind of all of these ordinary experiences of feeling guilty is we get this sense that we've failed to live up to some principle, failed to live up to our obligations to others, failed to pay something back. And so what Heidegger focuses on here is that in all of these, we get what he calls here, and this is again a direct quote from him, we get the sense that we are a being which has been defined by a not. That is to say, we are the basis of nullity. And so, again, he tries to kind of take these ordinary experiences of guilt, push them in a little bit more ontological direction, say, well, what this feeling of guilt tells us when we feel our conscience kind of pulling us to feel guilty is that our existence is kind of permeated with nullity, with not being, not doing what we said we were going to do, not living up to a certain moral ideal, not fulfilling our obligations to others. All of that stuff involves a not. And so what we really get ontologically out of this experience of conscience and guilt is where the nullity in our being is revealed to us through that. So this is then where, I kind of do a real quick pass through of this in this paper because this was something I did in more depth in an earlier paper. But this is where Heidegger thinks we sort of get the proper phenomenological understanding of human existence. That, earlier in Being and Time, he kind of tells you what he thinks are the basic aspects of being human, but he thinks that, on good phenomenological principles, you don't really know anything unless you've revealed it to yourself. And the way you do that is by properly responding to the call of conscience, recognizing this nullity in your existence. And I mentioned a while back, for him, kind of the two main components of human existence are this sense of thrownness, that we're thrown into a world already existing in certain possibilities that are beyond our control, and then the other side of that, that's kind of going into the past. Going into the future is this sense of, this aspect of projection, that we're always existing beyond our current situation, projecting into future possibilities, already thinking where we're going, have an endpoint in mind for what we're doing in all those sort of everyday ways. And so he thinks that experiencing guilt reveals this to us, sort of directly in this pure phenomenological sense. And so the way he tries to show that is to say that both thrownness and projection are characterized by nullity, by having this not fundamentally part of one's existence. And so for thrownness, I think that's easier to see that. That here's a quote from Heidegger that I think is reasonably clear for him. So he says, as being, Dasein is something that has been thrown. It has been brought into its there, but not of its own accord. And put a little bit differently, as being, Dasein has taken the definite form of a potentiality for being, which has heard itself and has devoted itself to itself, but not as itself. So again, this idea that, before we ever have the ability to kind of reflect on our own lives or think about who we are as people, we've already been existing in certain ways that we've been thrown into that are not of our making, are not of our choice. And so when we're confronted with this call of conscience to recognize this nullity fundamental in our existence, we come to recognize this aspect of thrownness in our existence. And that, to Heidegger, is kind of getting at this fundamental understanding of the ontological structure of being human. And so, and I don't know that this factors too much in, but just for the sake of completeness here, on the other side of that, he thinks that there's also this nullity inherent in projecting ourselves into the future as well. That well, actually, maybe for time's sake, I might skip a little bit of that here. So, what he says is that, in having, these are again his words, in having a potentiality for being, Dasein always stands in one possibility or another. It constantly is not other possibilities. And it has waived these. And so the idea is, sort of going forward in your life, you have to make choices about who you're going to be as a person, how you're going to live, and that necessarily involves excluding other possible ways of existing. And so he thinks that you have that not, again, kind of fundamentally built into that forward projecting aspect of your existence. And so again, you're kind of brought face to face with that phenomenologically through this experience of guilt. Okay, so remember the point of this was to try to show that, in making oneself into a person, you have to have that knowledge, that ontological knowledge of what it is to be human. And so responding to the call of conscience is that first level of responsiveness, that you respond to that call to make yourself into a person. And in responding to that, you also have this ontological structure of being human revealed to you through this experience of guilt that he's talking about. And then this leads to what I call on the handout there, the second aspect of responsiveness on the back page, or the back of the handout, that we're not just responsive in the sense of responding to this duty to make ourselves into persons, but then when we come to understand what it is to be human, to have this thrownness as a fundamental aspect of our existence, we also realize that we have to be responsive in a second way. That we have been thrown into certain ways of existing that we didn't pick, that weren't under our control, and we have to still somehow respond to these, to do something with them. And so there is this sort of, more internal, more formal sense of responsiveness where you respond to the duty to make yourself into a person, and in doing so, you recognize that part of being a person is to already be existing in certain ways that you didn't choose, and that you still have to respond to. So this is kind of the second, more externally directed type of responsiveness that gets built in here. And so I wanted to, close in the last section here by trying to give something of a concrete example to think through how this might work from my point of view. And I was thinking here, okay, so if we're supposed to have possible ways of existing into which we've been thrown, that we still have to respond to, we didn't have any choice about these things, what are some examples of these types of ways of existing? So I was thinking, like the country you're born in is something that you're thrown into that you didn't pick, you don't have control over. Who your parents are. You're somebody's son or daughter, and you just are thrown into that you obviously don't have any control over that. So you're born into being a speaker of a certain type of language, and you just have to kind of make something of that and respond to that as you go. And so I was thinking, if you kind of work with the example, and maybe it's the current political climate that influenced my thoughts here, that so if you work with the example of being an American, at least for me, this is something that I was born here, had no choice about. That in some sense, I exist as an American. I can always respond to that negatively and move to another country because they, I hate U.S. foreign policy or something like that. But it's still a way of existing, part of who I am, that I've been thrown into, that I have to respond to in some way. And so I thought we might be able to just think through this and think how would one be a responsible agent with regard to this possible way of existing. And so I thought, we can kind of characterize negative ways in which people could fail to be responsible Americans. And so, one way I was thinking, one mode of failure here is that, like the example I mentioned earlier of, a woman who is born in a patriarchal society and is just completely and totally responsive to others and is so unreflectively. You could be an American in the same way. You could be, I was just thinking, and I don't know, I think all of these end up being kind of crude, not very nice stereotypes, but that if you're the sort of person who just unreflectively has an American flag on their porch and sets off fireworks on the 4th of July, rides around on a Harley with an American flag bandana, that maybe that's, if someone just completely unreflectively kind of moves into that way of existing and that way of responding to being an American without any sort of conscious reflection on what they're doing, that would be a failure to be a responsible agent for being completely unreflectively responsive. And so you're just totally responding to this way of existing, this identity, without any reflection, without any more well-developed sense of self going on there. And then I was thinking, another way to fail to be responsible would be if you do reflect about this, and maybe and I was thinking Strawson here could be an example. You reflect about this, you recognize that, you have this intuition at least that there's something important about being a self, being a person, but you might have the wrong ontological understanding of what it is to be a person. And so, somebody like Strawson could look at, from his conception of being a self, that, being a self is having this collection of different character traits, and if you really want to be a responsible self, you have to have all of these under your control. And so from that point of view, being thrown into being an American, that's actually a detriment to being the cause of yourself, because that's something that you've been thrown into over which you have no control. And so that could be sort of a failure to recognize what it properly means to be a self, and what it properly means to have these responsibilities or have these ways of existing that you're thrown into. And then, and so that kind of corresponds to that first aspect of being responsive, that you are kind of responsive to that demand or that duty to be a self, but you don't have that proper ontological understanding. And then I was thinking the third way you could fail to be a responsible agent is to kind of recognize, okay, I do have a duty to kind of reflectively make myself into a person and respond in some way to those ways of existing I've been thrown into, but you could just be mistaken about what ways of existing actually are there in your character that you need to respond to, that you might just not really recognize that your nationality is anything that you have to respond to, deal with in some way, and just sort of make a mistake on that more concrete, practical level, and fail to be properly responsible in that sense. And so then, kind of going the other way and saying, well, what would a truly responsible agent look like in the sense that I've developed with regard to being an American? Is that's where you would have to, first of all, feel that call to make yourself into a person, have that proper ontological awareness to say, well, being a person is having certain possibilities that I've been thrown into that I have to respond to, and then recognizing your nationality, your being an American, as one of those possibilities that you have to respond to and deal with in some way. And so it's setting this pretty high bar, I think, for what it would take to qualify as a responsible agent. But I think it does so without going back to any sort of causal notions about you having to be the cause of yourself or yourself having to be the cause of your actions. Incorporates this aspect of responsiveness, but also has, I hope, some more robust sense of selfhood in there too. And so that, and again, I don't know if this is really sufficient, but I was thinking that, since it does set a pretty high bar for being responsible, it might respond to Strawson's criticism. There aren't any other worthwhile conceptions of responsibility, because you think, well, if somebody really meets this high bar of being a responsible agent, then yeah, I do feel okay condemning or praising this person on that basis. There might be few people that actually fit into this category of being responsible agents in the strong sense, but if somebody does, it seems like there are stringent enough requirements that you could feel okay actually blaming them or praising them for their actions. And so that's about where I end. I don't know if it's completely kind of finished everything I promised to do or want to do, but that's what I have. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.